I work with DNA, our very own manual of life. It's in our blood, in every cell of our body, orchestrating our life processes. DNA is a ladder of just 4 linked molecules, A, C, G, and T, strung together in pairs in an incredibly long and complex sequence. If laid out, the DNA from one person would stretch to the moon and back 3,000 times. In our cells, this chain is broken into 46 bundles called chromosomes. Because of its sheer length, DNA is prone to develop small glitches in its sequence. They're called mutations. Everybody has them. When they occur, we pass them on to our children. We call these inherited mutations markers. As our chromosomes pass down through the generations, they carry these markers with them. They write our history. They are the source of our time machine, the way we can see back to our earliest ancestors. The markers I follow are found only in men, on their Y chromosome, the chromosome that makes men men. But of course, men don't travel alone, and the journey of man is the journey of everyone. I was walking through the village and I saw that they had massive piles of these sitting around everywhere. We call them monkey oranges. And they taste pretty good. They're a little bit like papayas. But I thought it would be a good idea to use them to explain exactly what we mean when we say we're following genetic markers. This is a man at some point in the past. The thing that makes him a man is his Y chromosome, a piece of DNA that's unique to men. When men have sons, they pass on their Y chromosome to those sons. Again, it's what makes them sons. So if we imagine that this man had 2 sons, they would have essentially identical DNA on the Y chromosome to their father. So they would get his Y chromosome in effect. And if we imagine that they also have sons, those sons, the grandsons of this very first man, would also have essentially the same DNA. But occasionally, when we pass on these pieces of DNA, we get a change in a single letter in the sequence. We can call those mutations or markers, and that's what allows geneticists to trace descent. Now I've represented this marker with a little strip of tape, a little black bar. And just like before, all of the sons of this particular man will have essentially the same Y chromosome, so they will inherit this marker. And in that way, the marker acts effectively as a badge of descent, a marker of descent from this particular man, and that's what we follow. Now, as we move further down the tree, most of the sons will inherit just that single bar, but occasionally, as we saw before, we will get a second change in the Y chromosome. A second marker appears, showing descent from a particular man, in this case this person, who has first that marker, which came from that person back there, but an additional unique change on his Y chromosome, which he then passes on to all of his descendants. So in the people that we're talking about living in the present day, in this part of the tree, they've got 2 markers. They clearly trace their descent from this man, but the first marker, remember, arose all the way back there, all those generations ago. I'm off to meet an ancient tribe who traced their family line back to Siberia, to the ancestors of the Chukchi who made that first migration into the Americas. They're the Navajo, and they live here in Canyon de Chelly, Arizona. The Navajo Indians have been living in North America ever since their Chukchi ancestors first arrived. Canyon de Chelly is one of their most sacred sites. I wanted to tell them about the genetic trail that had led me to them. But I soon learned they had migration stories of their own. Thanks a lot for inviting me up here to your place.
You're welcome. Enjoy having me.
It's gorgeous here.
We're glad to share the information about our place here.
Can you tell me a little bit about the place, how long you've lived here?
This is the junction of Canyon de Chelly. We got this piece of land from my great-grandfather.
This is our hogan.
Yeah.
We have a story of where we came from, and our story, our origin is a very sacred stories, and it's passed on through generations, and that's your your life and your way of where you came from. And I'm sure that these two has some other information too.
Phil Bluehouse explained.
Well, adding to what Letty has to say, there is a creation and journey narrative that we go back to, and this narrative is quite sacred. It talks about the event of creation. We call that Hajine in Navajo, or at the time of beginning.
Do you have any stories about where the ancestors, the ancestors of everyone may have come from?
It depends on how you, there are discussions about migrations. I mean, when we migrate from our mother onto the earth's surface, that is a migration narrative. I mean, we come from one being to another. That's a migration. If we believe that we were created here in the Four Sacred Mountain area, this is where we came up from the ground. In other words, we were birthed into this place, just like we are all birthed by our mother.
I also have my own sense of what that story might be using science. I'm a geneticist. And everybody around the world is very closely related to each other. We're all part of one big family. In fact, we're all related to people who lived in Africa as recently as 50,000 years ago. That's only about 2,000 generations. So you have distant relatives living all over the world who are essentially African. And you yourselves are essentially African. So am I. Can I show you some pictures of some of the people we've met?
Yep.
These are people known as the San Bushmen who live in southern Africa. And they are some of the oldest people on the planet.
Are these the people that have that clicking sound?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, exactly. Fascinating people. Now, the evidence is that the first people who left Africa followed a coastal migration route along the south coast of Asia, and they ended up in Australia. The Australian Aborigines. We visited them.
So you're basing this on the genetic trail?
Exactly.
Now, these people who were in Australia, they mainly were more together as a group, you know, like
More cohesive.
more cohesive and
There are lots of different populations in Australia, speaking very different languages. They have different cultures, different myths.
Why do you call something that a people will tell you a myth, as opposed to an experience that they had and they relive it over and over, rather than calling it a myth? Would be able to call it something else, because I have a real strong feeling about that. That, you know, if you call something a myth, it's a substandard event that does not
That's a
have
good
any
point.
relevance, because they are real as we understand them. They're not myths. And
Absolutely. That's a very good point. And my bias as a scientist is that I like to see evidence for things.
Yeah. Okay.
So that was the first migration out of Africa, according to the genetic results that we got. Now the next one followed a slightly different route, one that went inland.
I'm getting pretty good at this.
And
Of
they
course,
ended up
it
in
helps that I
Central
brought the
Asia.
family album along.
And this man is a direct descendant of a person who lived in Central Asia about 35 to 40,000 years ago.
Wow.
And his ancestor is also the ancestor of most Europeans and Native Americans.
Wow.
He's a man called Niazov, who lives in Kazakhstan.
Are you the same person that did some research I noticed on the internet that says that the Native American people are somehow connected to
Yes.
Central Europe,
Yes, Central Asia.
Central Asia?
Yeah, that was a
Wow.
paper that we published last year.
Okay. That's good to know.
What do you think of that?
You know, and I was looking at a book from people from Central Asia, and I saw my cousin Emmett and Abraham, Auntie Grandma Buggy, and I said, my God, I got family over there in Central Asia. These were the
like
Mongolian
this.
people.
yeah.
They're Central Asians.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
That's it right there. In the eye, he looks like Oriental, and then he's got Negro features to some extent, and also Caucasian, kind of all mixed together. So that's interesting, very interesting.
These are the Chukchi people, and they're your
They're still
distant
in
cousins.
Siberia.
They're still living in northeastern Siberia. I visited them recently
Oh, they're the ones that have
With the
these
reindeer.
with the reindeer. Yeah.
Reindeer. I've seen them on TV.
Their home is
They're
Yeah, the home looks like a
looking.
teepee. And the results show that they are your ancestors. They ultimately made that trip across the Bering Strait into the Americas.
Wow.
about how tall were these guys here?
About 5'8", 5'6", 5'8". Yeah,
About
not too
tallest.
tall. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And by looking at the genetic data, we can estimate that as few as 10 or possibly 20 people were in that first group, the first wave of migration into the Americas.
My story about the journey of man came as no surprise to these Navajo. The idea of migration had been central to their own creation story since the beginning of time.
The point is that somehow we're finally saying, acknowledging one another from the scientific realm and from the traditional realm, saying that, yeah, the puzzle is starting to fit together.
And we complement each other.
And we're all complementing each other.